Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the life and letters of the Apostle Peter. When we were together last time, we talked about the Jerusalem conference in Acts chapter 15, and the way the Apostle Peter, after the incident that Paul describes in Galatians, in the book of Galatians, where he had to face him down and in front of everyone, and confront him with the racism that he was guilty of there at the church at Antioch. Then in Acts chapter 15, when Paul is at Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas giving an account, it is Peter that stands up first and just stakes his claim and says, what these men are doing is from God. This is wonderful. We should embrace this and glorify God on account of the wonderful work that these two men have been doing. So that's a wonderful way kind of to conclude what we know of Peter's ministry from the book of Acts. We really don't see Peter again after the Jerusalem conference in Acts chapter 15. The book of Acts is divided, not exactly evenly, but divided into two sections, the section in which Peter takes the lead and the section in which Paul takes the lead, and then there are a few chapters of transition in which we go back and forth between the two men. But we bid goodbye to Peter from the book of Acts there in Acts chapter 15. Although we do know more about him, mainly from Paul's writings and then from just the biographical information we have from Peter in his own letters. So I did want to talk about that. We know from Paul, from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, that Peter is a traveling missionary, and that as he travels, the way Paul is traveling, he takes his wife with him. So we do know this, that Peter has spent the years between the Jerusalem conference, which probably happened in the late 40s, and his death, which probably happened in the early to mid 60s, as a traveling missionary, at least a large part of the time. We also know that there was a period of time in which he stayed put, because in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1, we know that at some point Peter served not only as a missionary and was not only an apostle, but served as an elder in a local congregation. He's writing to the elders in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 and following, as one who has also served as a fellow elder in the church. So we know that not only did he travel as a missionary and take his wife along, but also that he stayed put long enough at least one congregation to serve as an elder at that congregation. We also know something of where he traveled, I think, because in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, we read that Peter is writing to brethren who live basically in Turkey, in modern-day Turkey, because he mentions these Roman provinces, all of which are in Turkey. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as aliens scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who were chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. So he's done missionary work basically in Turkey. He's known to the churches of Asia. So that's interesting that he served in Asia, which is where Paul had an enormous work and where John had an enormous work. Paul, Peter, and John, all three addressed the churches of Asia in their letters, which I think is a pretty cool thing to think about. This also means that his ministry has largely been among Gentiles. We know from history that Paul died first, and then Peter died. Both of them in close proximity to each other in time, and in the same town. They died at Rome during Nero's great persecution of AD 63 and following, which we'll talk more about as we introduce 1st and 2nd Peter. Paul has died first. We know from reading the end of First Peter, and we'll talk about that when we get to First Peter. We know, one, that Peter's in Rome when he writes First Peter. We know, two, that Paul's people are now his people. So Mark is there, and others are there that work with Paul. Silas, for instance. So we know that Paul's team is now Peter's team. We also have Paul referring to Peter, Peter referring to Paul in his writings as Scripture, but in the past tense. So we have a very small window of time in which First Peter and then Second Peter, which is a subsequent letter, could have been written. And we'll talk about that more later. But he died, according to Eusebius and other historical sources, by crucifixion. And the tradition is that he insisted upon being crucified upside down. Whether the Romans honored that request or not, even if he made it, I have my doubts. But it's not surprising at all that he would have been crucified. People died in horrendous ways during the persecution of Nero. And we'll talk about that when we introduce 2 Peter. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the writing of the book of Mark and how Peter is the likely source for Mark's gospel and what that means as we study Mark's gospel. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.